John, for those that haven't come across you online, introduce yourself and tell our listeners what we're talking about today.
My name is John LaMattina. I'm the former president of Pfizer Global R&D. I retired from Pfizer after a 30-year career there, and since that time, I've been involved with the biotech industry, serving on boards and things like that. But I've also become an author, and I've written a few books talking about the pharmaceutical industry and different issues around that. And I'm here today to talk about my latest book, Pharma and Profits, Balancing Innovation, Medicines, and Drug Prices.
When people talk about pricing, if you can picture those people in your mind, who are those people that kind of get under your skin talking about this? Is it the general public? Is it some reporters that are trying to shove the mic in your face? When you think of somebody who is pressing this issue, who comes to mind?
One of the reasons I wrote my book was because I was asked, particularly during the pandemic, a lot about drugs and pricing and discovery of vaccines, things like that. But what really irked me was that I was asked by a British journalist, actually, who said to me, in the first year of selling its vaccine, Pfizer will make $36 billion just in that year vaccine. And then he said, how much of that do you think they deserve? And that really drove me nuts, because people will forget how in the early days of the pandemic, in a place like New York City, people were dying on the order of 800 a day. So many people were dying every day that they had to take the bodies of the recently deceased and put them into refrigerator trucks.
Yeah.
And the pharmaceutical companies, and while Pfizer and Moderna get all the credit, the fact of the matter is a lot of companies worked on vaccines. Obviously, the latter two were the most successful, but nevertheless, many companies were involved in this. In fact, I would argue the whole biopharma industry was working pretty hard on coming up with treatments, antibodies, and vaccines. And thankfully, Pfizer and Moderna were able to do this in an unprecedented amount of time. In 9 months' time, from starting to work on it to the time when vaccines were being put into the arms of first responders and people working in hospitals. It's just an amazing feat. And when I was asked the question by the journalist, it implied that the industry was trying to capitalize on a pandemic and make money. And the fact of the matter is, these were priced at a very reasonable price, at $19.50 a shot, or a total of $39 for your first set of two vaccines. Pales in comparison to even something like the flu vaccine, which I just recently got my new flu vaccine, and Medicare will pay like $75 for that vaccine. So I think that what I try to do in most of my writings is to correct misperceptions and to show a different light of where drug companies and biotech companies are in the fight against disease.
If there was ever a time when you could ask or price something to the moon, COVID certainly would have been it.
In the June before Pfizer and Moderna were able to launch the vaccines, there was an article in the New York Times, and the gist of the article, op-ed from an author, Elizabeth Rosenthal, was that beware what you wish for. And she went down the road and said, well, if a vaccine is in fact found and found to be effective, the companies may charge as much as $500 for that vaccine. And she justified it based on, well, you have shingles vaccines, which cost in the order of $300 or $400, or vaccines for meningitis, which are also highly priced. And she said, these are life-saving drugs. So, and then she went on to say that, and of course, at $500 a vaccine, these companies will make about $180 billion just in the United States. And that would be pure profit. And so, again, went down the road. And of course, it wasn't $500 or $300 or $100. It was $39 for the two doses. Very and that's, by the way, in Western countries. In poorer countries, particularly in Africa, the vaccine is sold at cost.
Those numbers, they're always kind of nebulous to me when we start talking about billions and things like that. I remember that Dennis Miller on Saturday Night Live one time, he said $50 billion. He said, most people can't wrap their heads around what $50 billion is. And he says, picture a $1 billion bill. Now picture having 50 of those things stacked on top of each other. But here's the thing. It's hard to wrap your head around things, not because they're unfair. They're just so big. But when people start talking about this company should have done that and that should have done that, it's like, all right, what have you done for free lately? Or when did you take a cut of half of your salary to join this movement? You know, it's like at the bigger dollars, it looks good to start saying this should have happened and that should have happened. But when it comes down to the individual reporter or the individual complainer, it's like, did you give half of your income away for this cause? And the answer is no, of course.
Well, you raise a good point. And part of the reason I wrote the book was not just to talk about the vaccines, but all sorts of other drugs that are important that have really changed the course of treating or curing diseases. One of the early things, the first chapter, in fact, that I write in this book is about drugs that treat hepatitis C. Hepatitis C, for those who don't know much about it, is a silent disease. You get it through being in contact with infected blood, be it through transfusions or other ways. And it is the leading cause of liver cancer in the United States because this form of hepatitis infects the liver, and you get cirrhosis of the liver, you can get liver failure, you may need liver transplants, etc. A few years back now, a company called Gilead came out with a cure for hepatitis C, a single pill that you took every day for 3 months. And this pill, this treatment was superior to the existing treatments, which were hard to take, mostly injections you took for a year. They weren't all that effective, and they were very expensive. This new pill from Gilead was cheaper than the existing treatment, safer, and in 3 months, your hepatitis C is gone. And the potential need for a liver transplant, which can cost $300,000-$400,000 a patient, et cetera. Rather than extolling the industry for coming up with such a great drug, the focus was on the pill because the pill cost $1,000 a piece. And the articles in the news coverage was the new face of medicine, the $1,000 pill. Now, a couple of points here, Mike. Number one, that was the list price. That wasn't the actual price because companies negotiate with payers, insurance companies, as to what the price is. So that's the first factor. But within a year, another company, AbbVie, came up with their own version of a hepatitis C cure, and suddenly there was competition in the market, and the prices plummeted. And the prices came down to now where it's maybe $22,000 for a cure, which is 80% cheaper than the old cure was. And again, more effective, better treatment. But that doesn't get the headlines. That all sort of dissipates. And so, again, part of the book is to talk about things like that and to try and explain to people, yeah, it was $1,000 a pill. Yes, it doesn't cost $1,000 to make that pill, but all the research that went on into it and then supporting the pharmaceutical company R&D enterprises is not an easy thing to do. And companies, he said an interesting thing, nobody will give away stuff, half their salary or things for free. Clearly, these are businesses. And the other misconception is that these businesses are overly profitable, make more money than us. Fact of the matter is, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry compared to other industries, it's about in the middle in terms of profitability, return on capital, et cetera. So you said, what really frustrates me? Those are things that really bother me. And so when these occur, I try to counterbalance them.
It seems like companies, maybe because the boards turn over so fast or something, or the leadership, it seems like companies don't really want to save money. Like they'll be happy if you went to them after someone was treated for liver failure and they paid, millions of dollars. And then you say, hey, we'll take 95% of that away by letting you buy this tablet. It's like they'll gladly take that in reverse. But it's like not too many of them seem to want to do something prophylactically or an expensive drug, which is cheaper in the long run, because it's almost like they haven't shown a savings. It's kind of a future savings, but it's not real easy to go into a boardroom and say, look how much we saved. We bought these expensive tablets. It's almost like that's a risk for the person saying that because they can't prove it.
So here's a bunch of things that have happened, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years in the industry. First of all, companies, when they come up with a price, just don't pick something out of air. They do a tremendous amount of research called pharmacoeconomics, where they say, okay, if you had a cure for this disease, what would it be worth to society? And by the way, if it's a cure, it's saving lives, making the patients, changing the whole life of the patient, et cetera, in terms of their health. And a lot of work goes into that. Furthermore, and this is different over the last few years than history, companies, pharma companies will then go to the payers, the insurers, or other countries, in the case where countries negotiate the price of drugs, and talk about, we're coming up with this new cure. We hope it'll be approved within the next 18 to 24 months. Here is the price range we're thinking of charging. And you get feedback like that. And a lot of times now, when a drug price comes out, which might seem excessive, sometimes the payers will come and say, yeah, we've talked to Pfizer or Merck or whoever, and we understand their rationale, and we can support the rationale, because what goes into that rationale is the number of lives saved, the number of what's something called quality life years that one has. So not just years of that you're alive, but you might be hooked up to IV tubes, rather real quality of life tubes. And these are figures that get baked into the price. So nothing is just baked out of the air. But you touch upon something else, value in the long term. All these drugs, particularly small molecule drugs like the one I just talked about from Gilead for hepatitis C, these have a finite lifetime. They go generic. And when they go generic, the price plummets. The example I love to give is Pfizer's Lipitor. And Lipitor is a tremendously effective drug now. It's been available for 25 plus years. Great drug to help prevent heart attacks and strokes. And at its peak, Pfizer's sales were about $13 billion a year. Comes back to your Dennis Miller billions.
Yeah,
comment.
13 of those billion-dollar bills.
Those big, huge bills you're carrying around. A year after it went off patent, sales dropped to less than, probably about 90% less than they were. A brand name Lipitor. But the generic form, atorvastatin, exploded in terms of, you can buy now atorvastatin for literally pennies a day. You'll see advertisements, a 90-day supply for like $10, a ridiculously low price. I think more prescriptions are written for generic Lipitor, atorvastatin, than most other drugs. Maybe it's one of the top 3, et cetera. Pennies a day. This is what a fellow named Peter Kolchinsky coined as the great American drug deal. Yeah, you pay a premium price for the limited amount of sales you can have that are protected by your patents. And then the patent expires. And then suddenly these drugs become a lot cheaper. And so but when you talk about seeing the value, first of all, companies have to prove the value to payers, something that didn't happen 8-10 years ago, now happens routinely. And now they have to show the value, but then you have to negotiate cost with them and come to an agreement that the cost is reasonable. So it's not this simple thing that these people are trying to gouge prices, et cetera. And in fact, payers, and this is another example I give in my book, it's a new class of relatively new class of heart drugs now. They've been out for about 5 years that are called PCSK9 inhibitors. Basically, they help lower your bad cholesterol dramatically. In combination with generic atorvastatin and one of these drugs, you can lower your bad cholesterol to like 50. For most people, they're normal. If you're normal, just on statins, you can get it down to 100. So you can really drop this down. And these companies have shown that these drugs actually lower, for people who've already had a heart attack, reduce the recurrence rate of heart attacks by a good amount. So these are valuable drugs. Well, when they first came out, these are drugs that have to be injected, by the way. So you have to go into a hospital and get them injected twice a month. When these drugs first came out, they were priced at about $14,000 a year, and payers balked. Payers said, we're not paying that, only for the neediest people, because they were worried at a price of this nature with all the heart patients we have in this country, the price would go through the roof. So they actually prevented patients from getting this. Doctors had to go through hoops to try and get insurance companies to agree to that. Well, The prices eventually came down, and now is at about $4,000, $4,500 a year, I believe. I say I believe because these drugs, all these drug prices are not publicly announced. List prices are publicly announced. And most analyses that people criticize the industry on drug pricing only know the list price. The actual net price, the actual price that a company gets is not public knowledge because it's a competitive process. And Pfizer doesn't want CVS to know they got a certain deal and United Healthcare got a different deal, et cetera. Is that convoluted? Absolutely. But that's how the drug system works in this country. So here's a case where because of pricing, people weren't actually able to get the drugs. So there's all sorts of things now that exist in this whole drug pricing and drug system that people don't appreciate or understand.
What do you think, John, are the worst optics? And then what are the hardest things to justify or explain because of those optics?
Like, I'll give you a great example. The Pharma bro, Martin Shkreli. So here's a young man, very bright, who bought a company that sold a certain type of drug. The drug is called Daraprim. Daraprim was known for 80 years. It's a drug used to treat a certain type of fungal infection. Most people who get exposed to this fungus have no problems. But if your immune system, because your immune system just fights it off, if your immune system is compromised, if people like AIDS patients or other immunologic disorders, they will, if they get this infection, it can be life-threatening. So this was a drug, like I said, has been on market for 80 years. In the 2000s, it was manufactured by GSK, and GSK, it was only charging a few dollars for $1, maybe $2 for a pill, and they just wanted to get it off their books. They needed the manufacturing capabilities to do other things, et cetera. So they sold it to a company, and that company immediately raised the price to $12.50 a pill. Nobody really batted an eye. It's not that heavily prescribed or used, et cetera. And so it just went pretty much unnoticed. Hospitals basically sucked up the added cost. Martin Shkreli saw this. He went and bought the company that had the rights to Daraprim and raised the price to $750 a pill. And there was justifiable outrage. And this was used in headlines. All the criticisms are right. This guy bought this drug. There's no value added. He didn't come up with a new formulation or something. He didn't improve on it. Just take it and raise the price. And his response was, well, this is a life-saving drug. Life-saving drugs are worth $750 a pill. Well, the outrage was palpable and justified. In fact, the CEO of Merck came out and said, because what happened was everybody loved it. This is an example of how the pharmaceutical industry is out of control and raising prices. And Ken Frazier, who was the CEO of Merck at the time, said, this is not us. He is not one of us. He is a renegade who's doing this sort of thing. But that example, most people remember Pharma bro, Martin Shkreli, drug prices out of control.
Let's say, John, that you're giving Pharma bro advice before he did this. And he says, John, I just want to mark this up as far as I can. There's some point where if you gave him advice, you'd say, yes, you can move it up, but don't go up that high. If you were giving him PR advice or business advice and responsiveness to, let's say, shareholders, how high could you go, or at what area would you go before it goes into Pharma bro crazy and just moving something up the scale?
He never would have taken my advice because I would have told him if his intention was to buy this company and raise the price any amount, maybe a couple of dollars a pill or something, I would have said, you're nuts, and I would have resigned, because it goes back to the great American drug deal. Now, where the wheels fell off, nobody else was making it. Even though this is a generic drug that you could have made and sold for some minor amount of money, nobody else was making it. So and these people who got this fungal infection needed it. And so he had everybody captured. Now, it also turned out at that time, the FDA was very far backed up with applications for generic drug forms. They might have been in the hole about 4,000 applications. There might have been a Daraprim generic applications that would have come out that would have undercut it. And eventually, other people started making it because there was nothing preventing anybody else from making it, and the problem went away. But what advice I would give, I tell them to go do some other kind of business and not do this sort of thing.
You would say don't raise it at all because it's always going to look bad. Is it easier to come in with a newer drug, or why would you not raise it at all, though?
Well, because actually it had just been raised tenfold.
Oh, I see. I gotcha.
Right. So already it was increased about from $1.50 to $12.50 or something like that. So didn't make any sense.
When you look at the big companies, it's almost like a democracy with the shareholders. It's like the shareholders are kind of responsive of what they think is the right levels and who the right leaders are and what the right choices are. And that's kind of the stock price going up and down. So it seems like when these bigger companies are maybe doing something obscene, it's like, I'm just saying, if someone says that, it's almost like, well, let's look at every single stockholder who's invested here and kind of get their take on it. It's almost like they're kind of steering the ship.
The big companies don't do anything obscene when it comes to pricing, to be frank. There was, in the last 10 or 12 years, people forget that in the late 90s, pharma was the most admired industry of all the industries. In fact, Merck was the most admired company for 7 or 8 years in a row, and Pfizer was always in the top 10, et cetera. And then various things happened. In fact, this was the topic of my second book, Can Pharma Restore Its Broken Image? And I think companies got the right idea and very conscious of doing what's right, not just for shareholders, but for everybody. I think the pricing of the vaccines is a terrific example of that. But more important to this whole argument is that pharma prices, now again, I'm going to talk about two types of pricing, the list price and the net price. The list prices over the last few years has not gone above inflation. It's only been about 2 or 3%. And that's the list price. It turns out that there's now data that's appearing that over the last 5 years, net prices, the amount of money companies are getting, has dropped a bit. And it's dropped for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is in negotiating with insurance companies. They have to take cutbacks particularly when there's competition in a certain drug class, they have to give back money to the insurance companies. And so the net pricing is dropped. Most people think drug prices go up and up and up, and the list prices do to a certain extent. But in terms of the net prices, not, and they've in fact been declining. And this is why I wrote Pharma and Profits. Nobody knows this sort of stuff. And when you talk to people about them, they're sort of like, oh, I didn't know that. Then you give them actual data and you show them things. We're talking about the price of drugs. Drugs make up 13, maybe 14% of the total healthcare bill. The rest of that is doctors, hospitalization specialists, et cetera, et cetera. I've already talked about how drugs become generic. And I talked about how Lipitor went from a $13 billion a year drug in the United States down to hardly anything. Well, I'm of a certain age where most of my friends are facing things like hip replacements or knee replacements. Hip replacements have been known for 40 years, and there's no new technology regard to hip replacement. Yet those prices go up and up. A hip replacement in the United States costs $40,000. And by the way, a hip replacement in England is about $12,000, in France about $10,000, and in Poland it's $2,500. And hip replacements don't go generic. These prices are going to go up and up and up, et cetera. So again, drug companies are very conscious of their pricing concerns. They're also very concerned that they turn a profit to sustain their business as well as to keep shareholders happy. And I find it hard to believe that you can find many people who have insurance plans, savings plans, that a savings plan doesn't have some aspect of drug company or biotech company stocks in those plans. So about everybody is tied into all of this. Look, if the pandemic taught us anything, it's the value of drug companies and biotech companies in a time of need in a global pandemic. Who else was going to solve this problem? You're not going to go to research institutes or great universities, et cetera. It was the drug and biopharma industry that was going to solve this problem and did it beyond the wildest dreams of everybody. I want to make one more point about pricing. That comes back to my Medicaid, the fact that I'm on Medicare. So when you're Medicare, you get a quarterly statement which tells you how much Medicare is paid for your drugs and procedures, et cetera, et cetera. It's great to see. It turns out that if you go get your COVID shots or boosters at Walgreens and CVS, Walgreens or CVS will get $43 to administer that shot, more than double the cost of the vaccine itself. Furthermore, when you walk in, you have to stay there for 15 minutes to make sure nothing untoward happens. And so I challenge anybody to go into CVS or Walgreens and buy something. It is the greatest customer come on of anything, right? And they're getting double the cost of. So please give me a break when we talk about the big bad drug companies. It's not true.
It's so hard to look at things like knee replacements and physical therapy and all this kind of stuff. It's so gray. Drugs are an easy target. It's really easy to look at something black and white and crisp and say, this price is this, that's too high.
I think there's a reason for that. That is, most people pay a certain amount for their medicines out of pocket, and they see the price. And for the most part, unless you've had a catastrophic injury of sorts, all of your, anytime I've been in the hospital, I've never seen a bill. It just got taken care of, right? I was blessed without any major surgeries or things, or copays and things like that. So people don't see those bills. They do see their drug price. And then I'm going to pick on your industry a little bit and basically say, so why you can get a different price for the same medication at the same dose from one pharmacy to another? Why aren't they all standard? Certainly, Pfizer's drug price is the same if you get in the Midwest and Northeast or whatever. So, and that's another thing I have to say. Most pharmacists will, when a patient will complain at the counter about the price of their drug, will say, well, it's those drug companies, when maybe it's not quite the truth. And another thing that would surprise your listeners, for the most part, on average, only 48% of the price paid for a drug goes back to the inventing company. The rest goes to the supply chain involved in there as well. So there are other people sort of having their finger in the pie on this.
I've done now close to 200 shows on this, and I don't think once a guest of mine or I have complained about manufacturers' prices. Part of it is because we're all involved because of the 401s and things like that. And plus it's hard to, we just haven't. Maybe I'm just not bright enough to really parse that apart. But the average pharmacist, and you mentioned it there, the average pharmacist, our nemesis is the people in the middle, the pharmacy benefit managers.
There you go.
And in our pharmacy, John, we've been there for 70 years and 77 years. About 2 years ago, I had to either lock my doors and go out of business or make a change. And the change I made was that our pharmacy doesn't carry any brand names at all. The reason being is because we were only getting paid 90 cents on the dollar whenever we bought a brand name. So if I buy $10,000 in brand name drugs, we only would get paid $9,000 a few weeks later. Now, our complaint is not the manufacturer. I don't care what that price is, whether it's $5,000 or $15,000 or $30,000, but the middlemen, the pharmacy benefit managers, are taking so much out of it that they're only paying us 90 cents on the dollar. And so here I am sitting across from a guy who has a great career in medicine and brand name medicine. And it's a sad situation that the middle has scooped that out, that I can't even tell you that I'm selling a brand name in my pharmacy. Now, I'm one of the only pharmacies in the nation that does that, a handful of us, but it's just a sad state that that middle is so powerful.
Well, I agree with that. And we alluded to this earlier in the podcast. I will say, though, that Congress and the Senate now in particular have sort of come to the realization that, oh, what's happening here? Why are these people who aren't really adding a lot of value to this whole process getting such a big cut of what's happening? Initially, pharmacy benefits had a reasonable purpose. They would come in and try and negotiate pricing for drugs. But that was only a finite amount of money they could make. And now to keep their money, they're keeping more and more of money, which theoretically should be going back to the patients and the people who are paying for the drugs. And a whole lot less of that is happening now than 5 or 6 years ago. And so that needs to be looked at.
John, your career with Pfizer, what did that job entail, being the president of research and development?
Well, it was a wonderful, wonderful job. It was, I think, the best job in the industry, because at the time, I think Pfizer was recognized as the #1 company. And I had probably about 13,000 R&D people around the globe, literally, England, France, Japan, California, Michigan, St. Louis, Connecticut. Very smart people, very hardworking people, people who were very dedicated, who took that special knowledge they had, be it toxicology or clinical studies or biology or chemistry or whatever, and applied it to the unbelievable enterprise of discovering a new medicine that, if they were fortunate, can benefit millions and millions of people around the globe. But I have to say, I'm envious of those who were working, and I still live in a Pfizer community. The labs in Groton, Connecticut, although much smaller now, are still in play. And so I see them and I thank them for what they did. And I'm envious that they were part of one of the most important times in Pfizer's history. But a lot of travel, because I would try to visit each research site a couple of times a year. And the European ones a little bit more than that, as well as the domestic ones. I was on the corporate leadership team, and so I spent a lot of time in meetings in New York with the CEO and CFO and head of sales and marketing and chief lawyer, et cetera, taking care of things like that, representing R&D's view. So yeah, it was hard, but I don't regret a day of it. I'm not complaining at all. It was a terrific, terrific job. And like I said, I wish I was part of it during the pandemic, because it was a great time.
Who gave the, it seems like somebody would tell you, hey, John, we think that we should be looking at this kind of medicine or helping this kind of disease state. Or maybe you had those ideas that came from chemical stuff. How does that decision get made?
Sure, great. It gets based in two different areas. So for one thing, the corporation's needs. It doesn't do us any good to come up with a medicine that the corporation isn't interested in doing sales and marketing at. They may say, look, company Pfizer size may be successful if all it creates are drugs to treat 100 people here, 100 people there. So you have to have something that makes it. You have to have a major medical need. You have to have a good idea to come up with a new drug that would make a difference. If there's already drugs to treat a certain disease out there, you better have one that's a lot better, or have reason to believe it a lot better before you go out. And then it has to be in the wheelhouse of the corporation. Now, here's an interesting difference between Pfizer when I was there and now Pfizer now. And I don't think Pfizer's totally unique in this regard. But when I was at Pfizer, the major areas of research were neurosciences, a lot of which was depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, metabolic diseases, which were diabetes, obesity, heart disease, infectious diseases, antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals, and things like that, and a small effort in oncology. And that was our major field. But over the years, great treatments came up for things like depression or anxiety or lowering cholesterol or things of that nature. If you look at Pfizer's portfolio now, and you can do this, you go to Pfizer.com and look up a research pipeline, you can see the whole thing. A major emphasis in oncology, maybe 40 to 50% of the drugs in their pipeline are for oncology. A big presence in vaccines, thankfully. We weren't doing vaccines when I was there. Pfizer, a few years after I left, bought Wyeth, and Wyeth had a vaccine division, so Pfizer incorporated that, thankfully. It turned out to be a terrific move. So vaccines, a big immunology a group along the way, which balances out with cancer as well, and rare disease, which is a very important area. Pfizer as well. Totally different from when I was there. These are areas where new drugs are needed, areas where new drugs could get pricing if you're successful to help repay your investment in R&D, and in some cases, areas where you might not need huge chemical trials. It's interesting. The industry has gone largely from a single pill to lower cholesterol, or a single pill to lower blood pressure, to now areas of focus, because we understand more about disease now. We understand that breast cancer isn't just one thing. It's a constellation of different things. We understand the same as lung cancer. Rare diseases, there are lots of rare diseases where you can come up with drugs that, if successful, can save the healthcare system, will save lives, will change the lives of people, and also save the healthcare system a lot of money. So very different areas than when I was there.
So where did those come from? Is it the C-level guys and gals sitting around shooting the breeze saying, hey, we should maybe do more of this? Or is it looking at competition? How do those conversations take place to say we should do more of this? Is it a consultant team brought in? Where does that information come from?
I think the corporation has a sense of where they'd like to be. And then we've got outstanding research scientists who will say, hey, look, we need to build up a presence in the rare disease area. Here, our corporate partners think that there are a dozen very viable rare diseases that it would be great if we had an approach to treating that. And the scientists will go in and then they'll look at what's out there, what the competition is doing, as far as you can tell, what would be novel, what would be of value to patients and doctors and payers, and you factor that all in. Now, I'll come back to the pandemic again.
Yeah.
This was an interesting situation where I read, I don't know Albert Bourla, the CEO. We only overlapped a little bit, and he was in a different division than I was. But he wrote a book about his efforts, which I've read, and it's a terrific book. But in it, he talks about how, I think it was on a Friday when the pandemic was breaking, he said, we have to respond. And he brought his leadership team in and basically said, on Monday, I want your best ideas. And he didn't say, I want your best vaccine ideas. I want your best ideas on how we can help attack this and use, because the pandemic affected everybody. And on Monday, they came back with a list of things to try, and they bandied them about. And they basically already had a deal with this biotech company in Germany, BioNTech. And BioNTech was looking at mRNA vaccines. Pfizer was looking to come up with a new treatment, new type of flu vaccine. And they were already working on ideas for that. And the team came back and said, we think the BioNTech technology is pretty good and might be able to use this. Now, unproven, nobody knew if you could even deliver an mRNA vaccine to the cell and manufacture it. But the team did that. They also, at that time, thought about antiviral drugs. And one of the scientists came up with an idea to resurrect a program that he had and for a different type of coronavirus antiviral agent. And they resurrected that. That turned out to be Paxlovid. So there was, again, push and pull, both sides. But the science and the approaches and the ideas really have to come from your R&D folks.
Yeah, it seems it has to come there, because if you had some industries, you might have a marketing industry or beauty industry or something where the CEO can just come in and spout off ideas, and it can happen. You can build this. But as far as the drugs go, it doesn't do a lot of good for the CEO or the C team to be talking about stuff when you're decades away from something. It sounds like a lot of that has to come through the smart R&D kind of team, the scientists.
In my day, we would run a portfolio in different disease areas. And what actual approaches we took were all really on our own. When we got a compound that was interesting, that was starting to go in man, then the commercial people got involved, because they would look at the marketplace and look at where things were going and begin to talk about the kind of drug profile we'd want to have and have input into the kind of clinical trials you'd want to run. Obviously, the FDA has to comment on the clinical trials as well and approve them. But it was usually at that interface. Once you got stuff into into people that we got so play with.
In your days there, John, what type of person bothered you the most? What kind of coworker?
When you got an organization of thousands of people, you're going to have all the same problems in your organization that society will have. Anything that you can think of. And when people might have had an alcohol problem or something, you try and help them out. You try and get them the right treatment, et cetera, et cetera. We had a pretty supporting environment at a place like Pfizer. Certainly, there were some lines you couldn't cross. If anybody ever lied about data, they were gone. They were gone the moment it was found out, escorted out, et cetera. But for the most part, you have to have an environment, I believe, that is accepting and doesn't tolerate inappropriate behaviors. I have to admit, I learned a very important lesson in my days when I was a senior manager, and you would get 360-degree feedback, and meaning feedback not just from bosses, but people who reported to you. And I always believed in the view that said, treat people how you would like to be treated yourself. And I a long time, I believed that till I had one a senior member of my team who hated that, who would come into my office, and I would always say, if you need me, feel free to come see me. But she felt if she was doing that, it was a sign of weakness, and didn't do it. And then she also taught me that, John, sometimes I want to come in, and I don't want to just talk to you. I don't want you to answer and solve my problem. I just want to talk it out with you. And that was very important feedback. And when I came home and mentioned it to my wife, she said, yeah, you did the same thing at home too. And that is, you come in and I say, okay, well, why don't you do da, 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 da? And they feel like, well, I kind of feel stupid that I think of that myself. And I'm just trying to be helpful.
Did they forget that we're men? That's what men do. We're solvers,
Well, I think I had the same problem with men as well. So I didn't need to, but this was a great case where the feedback I got changed me and changed how I behaved, such that I would have this person came and said, all right, you want to talk about this, et cetera. And they would tell me, I said, fine, let's go for it. And we'd work on it from there. So in a big organization, have to do a lot of different things. For the most part, we would attract terrific talent, Mike. I mean, we rarely had to settle on people. Normally, we'd have trouble for an opening trying to pick between 2 or 3 great people. We were very blessed in that regard.
What was your most negative trait as you looked inside of yourself that made things difficult?
Patience is not a strength. But I have to tell you, that's very real. And the other one is trying not to be over controlling in the sense of trying to be all and be everything to all people, which nobody can really do. So I think those 2 things I try and damp down a bit.
What were the roles of people you reported to? And then what kind of people reported to you?
Well, as I moved up in management ranks, I would get to report to more and more senior people, and I would try and learn from them. I had one senior manager who was actually pretty forward-looking thinking, and not necessarily a strength. I was tremendous at executing and getting things done, but looking out to something 10 or 12 years out was not a particular strength. This person had that, which is so, and I tried to learn from that. I had another boss who could look at a problem, and we'd have these team meetings, and we're wrestling with all sorts of issues, and this senior leader was able to look at all that, and say, well, boom, 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 X, Y, and Z. Look at it and say, wow, that's it. And was able to sort through the extraneous stuff and really focus on what the real problem was. That was something I admired and tried to develop as well. So those were sort of things. I had some managers that weren't very good either. And I remember being in one session where me and one of my colleagues started getting into it. And this person was, oh, I like this. Good. Let's keep going with this. And I sort of looked at him and I said, what a jerk. right? So, so anyway, those are you try and learn both good and bad from the people you reported to.
Did you ever have people that maybe in the manager's role that you just said, how the hell did they get here?
There's something called, in the old days, the Peter Principle. This is about 50 years old. The Peter Principle was you keep rising to the level of your competence till you get to an area where you're not competent in.
Right.
But yes, there were certainly people who advanced probably far beyond they should have, but they eventually got replaced. I had one person reporting to me in particular who always wanted to be a manager, and I thought he was better suited to be a scientist. But at one point I had a need, and I couldn't articulate to him easily that he could succeed in that. So I gave him a chance. And then I ended up having to fire him eventually. So that was not fun. So you try and learn from things like that.
How has the new computing changed some of the things that, let's say, Pfizer did 20 years ago? And I'm thinking in terms of testing something where, let's say, you had to use, I'm just going to throw it out there, you had to use rats before, and now you can take computers and do all the pretend down the road, and the computer does all those things. Has that been a huge thing with your past, or are people still in there, doing the bubbles and the glass things?
No, artificial intelligence is changing the way everything is doing, from chemistry to even biology. How has it changed? It's speeding things up, getting greater insights into designing molecules that might be more active, greater insights into how diseases progress, et cetera. At the end of the day, though, it's sort of like you can't take 9 women and have them pregnant 1 month apiece and have a baby. 9 women have a baby in 1 month. You have to go through the full process. You have to run through toxicology, as the government requests for animal toxicology, before being allowed to go into humans. Maybe someday that'll change, but not for them. I don't see it for the most part. It's overly cautious, perhaps, but a caution I think that has to be taken. And then you have to go into humans, and even, there's not one human. Everybody's different. Everybody responds to drugs differently. I know people who can take one drug without a side effect at all, and other people who get blistering headaches when they take that very same drug at the same dose. And so that's why actually most therapeutic categories will have multiple entrants in it. A few reasons for that. One entrance is that drugs behave differently in different people. And so you want people to have alternatives, not to be shut out of a certain, but also for pricing and competition. When you have multiple drugs in the class out there, pricing will come down quite a bit as well, usually. So, but there's still a finite period of time where you have to take to do things and going forward. A pandemic was a little bit different. In that here, companies were working literally on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, with the FDA, doing everything in terms of how we're going to design this, what do you want to see, what would be acceptable, immediate feedback. And then the FDA bent over backwards to in these 45,000 patient studies, like Pfizer did, I think Moderna did 30,000 patients in a very rapid period of time, to simply approve the drug based on symptomatic. So in theory, what you would have done would be to dose people and seen in a community and make sure the antibodies are up and make sure that people who had higher antibodies weren't getting infected. All they did with the COVID vaccines on the first pass was symptomatology. 45,000 people, placebo versus those on the actual vaccine, and see who got symptoms. And they based it on that. Otherwise, they never would have gotten out as quickly as they did. But it worked. It helped that it worked so well as well.
What do you do now with your days? I know you're with some companies and maybe, I'm guessing, some consulting and things like that.
So, I serve. I have 2 main things. One is I serve on the boards of 5 different biotech companies. And while there's usually board work through the year, they tend to have 4 major board meetings a year. And they all tend to do them in the same months.
Of course.
March, June, September, and then late November, December.
Yeah, right.
Between Christmas, Thanksgiving and Christmas. So those times are very, very busy for me. But that you're also on board committees, and so you have audit committee meetings or compensation committee meetings and so. But those are usually one-off things that are scheduled on an ad hoc basis. So that's one thing. But then the other thing I've done since leaving Pfizer was to write. So Pharma and Profits is my third book. Drug Truths, Dispelling the Myths About Pharmaceutical R&D was first. And then I already alluded to Devalued and Distrusted, Can the Pharmaceutical Industry Restore Spoken Image? Now the third one. And then I write a blog that's carried on Forbes.com.
I remember seeing that.
Yeah. So those writings get me involved in all sorts of other things. I usually give lectures. Pre-pandemic, it was probably about 6 or 7 a year, but even now, it's coming back to 3 or 4 a year. Universities, national meetings where I could be a keynote speaker, things of that nature. So that keeps me relatively busy. I don't want to go back to how much I was working when I was at Pfizer. That was pretty intense, but enough that I keep my hand in it. I'm able to lend whatever expertise I have to companies, particularly younger people. When you've been doing this now for 45 years, you've seen a lot, learned a lot, reach back into things, and so people seem to value that input. And I'm happy to give it.
Growing up, I always thought it'd be kind of cool, like if someone could switch a job like 26 times a year. I don't have the skills, but it'd be cool if you could, frame in a house for 2 weeks a year, drive a truck for 2 weeks a year, do something with the Broadway orchestra for 2 weeks a year. But your stuff with the board, that's pretty cool. I think that would be about the closest thing that would come to meeting different people, and they all have different different styles and all that stuff. That seems pretty cool.
Absolutely, Mike. So a couple of things. I'm fortunate that most of the boards I'm working on do very different things. One is an oncology company. One is basically a royalties company. One is a company that looks to build new companies. And one company I work with is involved in trying to develop new ways to restore hearing. And one's a microbiome company. The beauty of it is, so I'm still learning stuff, even at my advanced age, with all of these things. I'm working on boards with really smart people, Nobel Prize winners on some of them, people who have been CEOs of great companies. So that's great. And then I get to see cutting edge science, which I normally wouldn't be exposed to. So you're right. It's a tremendous thing to be able to do. And I'm glad people have asked me to do it.
I imagine a lot of that's word of mouth, like, hey, John, there's an opening on this board and your name came up kind of thing.
A little bit of both. Sometimes people know of me and will reach out. So it's probably word of mouth is probably not right, but more in terms of knowing they're looking and they know me from Pfizer or from my writings or things like that. So that helps.
It comes up first that they're looking.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're looking for people, and at the type of person they're looking for. So. If they want somebody maybe more with a legal background on their board, or maybe a background in marketing, then obviously I'm not the person. But usually the early startup biotech boards are looking for people with both a science background and a company background. So that I usually can fit in that regard.
These boards, is it what I'm thinking, where at these 4 times a year, you're actually in a room for a day or something and you're making decisions and there's a dozen of you in there with a few people taking notes and things like that? Is that close?
That's pretty close. Basically, you have the leadership team of the company in, as well as the board. You'll have people coming in to make presentations about different areas, be it usually science and drug discovery or development, and the board will react to it. An ideal board, in my mind, is one that serves in an advisory capacity, and one that can provide guidance based on their experience. Now, the most important thing any board is hire a CEO, and the CEO reports to the board. So you have to do that in a diligent way. And that's important. But then also, if you have a really good leadership team for the company, it's more of a partnership as opposed to an authoritarian board coming in and making various demands, et cetera. That's the ideal situation where the board has a great deal of trust in the leadership team, which I'm fortunate that the boards I'm on do.
Yeah.
And then it's a partnership. Eventually, you're representing the shareholders on the board. You're their voice, so you've got to make sure that everything is going well, and that you're taking that responsibility seriously, because it is a legal position in that regard.
And I imagine you're seeing quite a bit of the supply and demand when it comes to CEOs and their compensation. You're hiring them, and there's a supply and demand, and that's where the wages are and stuff. And I imagine you guys are setting those too.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I serve on the compensation committee for all the companies I'm involved with, and it depends on the company. So certainly, there has been a tremendous demand on talent, particularly the Northeast, trying to get good people. And I'm not just talking for CEO or chief scientific officer. I'm talking about key lab personnel as well. And so what a company, what the compensation committee for a board will do is there are various consulting firms that are terrific in terms of providing data. Every company will create a list of their peer groups, and the board will approve that list of peer groups. And you base the peer groups on size, amount of sales, number of people in the company, type of company, et cetera.
What do you mean peer group?
Oh, so if you're an oncology biotech company, you would look to find a group of, say, 20 similar types of biotech immunology companies.
Gotcha.
That you could say you're close to. You wouldn't pick Pfizer as one, for example, right? And then you get all the data for their compensation at different levels, and then your own corporate philosophy for your biotech company could be, we want to pay in the median for both salary and then equity. So some companies may be, well, we don't have a lot of cash and we want to be a little bit less on the cash salary, but we'll give more equity. And then you look at the grid and you see where that should be, and you look at your own status, and then you make moves in that regard. So that's how that's usually done.
You mentioned some of the qualities that some of your cohorts had of, maybe looking a little bit further down the road and this and that. When you think of the CEOs on these boards that you're on, what's maybe the main quality or some main qualities that the CEO has maybe above everybody else in terms of what their personal qualities are?
Well, sometimes the CEO is the founder. The CEO is the one who originated, particularly in biotech. That's not an uncommon thing. Sometimes the CEO, maybe the founder, is a terrific scientist, but not necessarily have the experience. They may be in an academic institution or just come out of an academic. So you might look for somebody who's got experience being a CEO, who's maybe their company has just bought and now they're looking for things. So a variety of factors will come in depending on the need for that company.
You have a few books, and I know we talked about the one about the pricing of drugs. What are the themes of the other two?
The first book I ever wrote was called Drug Truths, Dispelling the Myths of Pharmaceutical R&D. And at the time I wrote this is in 2009, roughly, there were all sorts of idiotic views of the pharmaceutical industry. The industry isn't innovative. The industry only cares about Me Too drugs. The industry doesn't care about the safety of drugs. Stupid things like that. The interesting part about the book is not only did I make arguments against those views, but in each chapter, I gave an example of the discovery of a drug that addressed that. So, for example, in the chapter that talks about the industry is only interested in Me Too drugs, I talk about some of the things you and I have talked about already in terms of having competition in certain therapeutic class. Well, then I talk about the discovery of Lipitor. Lipitor was the 5th statin to the market, but it turned out to be the best. But it also almost was never developed. So it's the great story of how the drug was found, but it didn't distinguish itself in preclinical studies. And one of the discoverers, very passionate scientist, Roger Newton, and at a meeting, and this was discovered at Warner Lambert, which Pfizer bought in 2000. And at Warner Lambert, they were having a meeting to basically end the program. And Roger got in and got on his hands and knees, literally, and begged please continue this program. I just taken it to phase 1. I promise you're going to see something very different in phase 1. And they said, oh man, just to get this guy to stop, fine, do the phase 1 study, and then we'll end the program after that. And it turned out this drug lowered cholesterol twice as good as any other statin that was out there. So there are stories like that in the book that are give a lot of flavor and color to what we're doing. When they talk about in a chapter where it's people claim, well, the NIH really discovers drug. I give an example of Xeljanz, which you've probably seen commercials ad nauseum. Xeljanz was discovered because a Pfizer scientist named Paul Changelian went to a biology meeting in the immunology area in Vermont one summer. He almost didn't go to the meeting because his wife was like 8 months pregnant and worried about, wow, what happens to go into labor. But his wife, thankfully, recognized that it was an important meeting for him. She says, they have hospitals in Vermont. If I go into labor, the baby born in Vermont. Well, fortunately, she didn't go into labor there. But while Changelian was there, he ran into an old buddy of his, John O'Shea, who worked at the NIH. And O'Shea was looking for understanding bubble boy syndrome and why people had this immune deficiency. And he talked about a certain enzyme portal called JAK. And Paul at the time was looking for compounds to dampen down the immune system. And O'Shea looked at something that was causing no immune system in people. And Paul thought, if I could go and come up with a drug that would block this procedure in normal people, and particularly people whose immune systems are overactive, like in organ rejection or in rheumatoid arthritis, maybe I'd have a drug to treat that. So he did it. We did it, negotiating with the NIH to get access to the reagents, not exclusive. Anybody could have gotten them. And we went out and basically set up assays, got leads, synthesized compounds, and et cetera, et cetera. And as Paul would say, 17 years later, after he went to this meeting, Xeljanz was launched and over $1 billion spent, right? So $1.5 billion, 15, 16 years from talking to an NIH scientist. And O'Shea's work was very important. O'Shea's work triggered the idea in Changelian, and without that, nothing would have happened. But so anyway, I tell the Xeljanz story in this book. So the first book does all of those things. The second book was a result of, after writing the first book, I was invited to be on the Dr. Oz show. And I was called on a Wednesday by a producer who said, we're doing a show about drugs, and we have Dr. John Abramson coming on. Abramson was a noted pharma school, somebody who wrote books against the industry. And I said, okay, I'll come on the show. And this was a Wednesday, and I had to be at 30 Rockefeller Center at 7 a.m. on Friday morning. So I had about a couple of days. I went out and I got Amos's book and I read it. I said, oh, this should go all right. And I got there and I went into the makeup room and they put makeup on and they walked me on stage. And I look at the sign on there for the episode, 4 things drug companies don't want you to know. and it gets better. Oz now is about 110 people in the audience, but there's one section of about 30 or 40 separated out. And he says, drugs have side effects. So he goes to these people and says, well, have any of you ever had a side effect of a drug? They all stand up.
Of course.
And it sort of went downhill from there. But it was a very important for me to see, because 90% of the audience was female, and they looked at me like I was the devil, that I was an awful person, only wanted to make drugs to make money, and these drugs harm people, and things like that. And afterwards, one of my sons, who was socially aware, said, you got to get your word out more. He said, how do you do that? He said, you got to start a blog. Okay, how do I do that? He's taught me. And I said, so I started a blog. Who's going to know about this? Then you got to go on Twitter. So that was my entry into social media. But it also caused me to write Devalue and Distrust It, because there were things that the industry needed to do better. And there were also things the industry was doing well. And so I tried to put that out in the second book as well. Interestingly enough, a lot of the things I advocated for in the book have come to pass. So all clinical trials are now on clinicaltrials.gov. So you can go on and see that, and you can monitor your progress of things, tremendous things like that. All payments that companies make to doctors are over $10. now have to report it on every quarter. So these are things I think that have helped the industry and to get it better. And then finally, my Pharma and Profits, the newest book. So all of them have been based on my experience in the industry and doing this sort of thing and trying to set the record straight out there.
Well, John, golly, great having you on. I think for years, before social media, we heard a lot from big corporations down all that information, and there was nowhere for the little people to talk it over. And I think in the last 10 years or so, now you've got a lot of rumbling from below in social media. I think you do a good service for the industry of bringing both sides together a little bit and a little background from the industry, yet listening to the word of the people. And so thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for your kind words. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, good having you on, John. I look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you. Same here.